Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're taking a fascinating look at a period of pretty significant growth for Christian movements across Asia.
Yeah, we're talking the 1990s, early 2000s mainly.
Exactly. We've pulled together quite a range of reports, some analyses, trying to explore how these faith communities really expanded.
And in such diverse settings, too. I mean, you've got Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Cambodia, other parts of Southeast Asia.
Right. And we'll even, touch on Singapore and South Korea for some comparisons.
Mhm.
So the goal really is to try and understand the key factors behind these, big increases in believers, new churches starting up.
In often really challenging cultural, sometimes political contexts.
Absolutely. And just for you listening, don't worry if you're not deep in all the technical stuff. We're aiming to pull out the most important, most intriguing bits without getting bogged down.
Yeah, focus on the core story here.
Okay, so let's jump in.
Where do we start? Mongolia.
Let's start in Mongolia. Okay, picture this. It's December 1990.
Right. The Soviet influence is still there, but weakening.
Yeah, and the country's facing some serious problems. Poverty, illiteracy, crime, unemployment. The whole economic system's kind of crumbling.
It's a tough scene, and that's when Stan and Laura Kirk arrive, right? American missionaries.
That's them. He was a pharmacist, apparently. They felt called to go to Ulaanbaatar, right into this really uncertain environment.
And it wasn't easy for them at first, was it? The sources really highlight the hardship.
Oh, yeah. That first winter. Severe food shortages. Stan lost a lot of weight.
And Laura, too, even more, apparently, while nursing their daughter. The old system was just collapsing.
No free market yet to replace it. It's hard to imagine.
But then things started to shift.
Yeah, just a year later, you start seeing a free market emerge.
Okay.
And the Kirks, they managed to move into an apartment with heating, which must have been huge.
A massive difference, I bet.
And maybe more importantly, they started seeing what they called a growing harvest of Mongolian believers.
Which is amazing considering where things started. How many Christians were there initially?
Get this. In 1990, only 6 known Mongolian Christians in the entire country.
Wow. Just 6.
But by 91, so just a year on, 2 churches had formed in Ulaanbaatar.
Already?
Yeah, and others were starting in different towns. Stan even started mentoring a young Mongolian guy who became a pastor.
That's rapid growth. It does make you wonder, like you said, in that kind of turmoil, were people searching, looking for something new?
It seems plausible, doesn't it? Times of big change often open people up to new ideas, new sources of hope.
For sure. And that early growth, it really suggests there was a receptivity there. Plus, you had more missionaries arriving.
Right, from different places. Koreans were a big part of that, apparently. Makes sense, given the proximity.
Yeah, proximity, maybe some shared linguistic roots helping out, too.
And then there was the New Testament.
Ah, yes, the updated Mongolian version in 96.
That seems like a real catalyst. The first printing, 10,000 copies.
Sold out in a month.
Yeah, there's something about the demand, right? People wanted it in their own language.
Absolutely. Access to scripture in the vernacular is almost always a key factor. It shows deep spiritual interest.
So by 97, people are describing the growth like it's the first century. Reports of miracles, explosive growth.
And even doctrinal challenges, which sounds counterintuitive, but actually shows things are moving fast, right? People are grappling with new beliefs.
Good point. And then Mission Frontiers magazine, July 98, they report over 10,000 Mongolian believers.
From 6 to over 10,000 in less than a decade. That's quite a story.
Incredible. And the sources give us some clues why. They mention a missionary, Rick Leatherwood.
Okay, what did he observe?
Well, firstly, he stressed that the missionaries genuinely loved the Mongolian people. That seemed foundational.
That personal connection matters.
Definitely. And then strong missiological principles, like really prioritizing training local indigenous leaders.
Ah, the sustainability piece,
Right.
not just foreign-led.
Exactly. Empowering Mongolians to lead their own churches.
Yeah.
He also mentioned modeling the Bible as the authority for decisions, setting up the church as a cell church movement, small groups multiplying.
Makes sense for rapid, decentralized growth.
Right, and even encouraging believers to write their own Christian songs in Mongolian.
Right, making the faith culturally resonant, using their own music, their own expressions. That's powerful.
Very. It personalizes the whole experience.
And that cell church model, it fosters community and it's adaptable.
Now, there's kind of bittersweet note here. The Kirks, Stan and Laura, who were there at the very beginning,
Yeah.
they actually had to go back to the U.S. in 97. Family health reasons.
Oh, that's tough. After seeing all that begin.
It is. But Stan apparently sent an email in 98 confirming the 10,000 believers number and just expressing his joy at having been part of that rebirth.
Wow. It really highlights the personal side of these things, the sacrifices involved. But they clearly helped lay a crucial foundation.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. South to Inner Mongolia in China.
Okay. Different context again. Part of China, obviously, but with a large Mongol population.
Exactly. Yeah. Historically, the Mongols kind of got split up after Genghis Khan, and the biggest group ended up there.
Right.
And here, the spark for growth wasn't so much external missionaries coming in.
Oh. What was it then?
It was more the witness of Chinese house churches. They ignited what the sources call a church planting movement, or CPM, within Inner Mongolia.
So local believers starting new churches among their own people.
Pretty much, yeah. That's the core idea of a CPM.
That really speaks to the power of indigenous movements, doesn't it? And believers sharing faith within their own culture.
It does. And shows how these things can connect cross borders, even political ones.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, the reports are pretty staggering. Summer of 2001, Chinese house church leaders reported baptizing 500,000 people.
500,000.
In Inner Mongolia over just 12 months.
Wow. That's massive growth. Was it concentrated somewhere?
No, apparently quite widespread. Cities like Haler, Huad, Yakeishi, others mentioned too.
Okay. And was this primarily among the ethnic Chinese population there, or?
Mostly ethnic Chinese, yes, but significantly it impacted the Mongolian population too.
Ah, it's true.
The Voice of China newsletter reported at least 50,000 ethnic Mongolian converts.
50,000?
Yeah, urban dwellers, but also nomadic people. Many apparently had never even heard the gospel before this.
That really shows the reach of those house church networks adapting to different communities.
Urban, rural, nomadic.
Mm.
They seem to connect across the board.
Okay, so Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, where next? Cambodia.
Let's go to Cambodia.
Yeah.
And here, the backdrop is just devastating.
The aftermath of the Vietnam War, Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, unimaginable suffering.
Millions killed, starved, displaced.
Right.
And the regime systematically targeted leaders, educated people.
And anything seen as foreign, which included Christianity.
Exactly. The evangelical population was tiny to begin with, maybe under 5,000.
And by the 80s, it was decimated. Less than 600 people left, the sources say.
Just horrific. Christianity was viewed with intense suspicion, hostility.
And yet, out of that devastation, you start seeing these signs of new life.
It's quite remarkable. Things like Christian hymns being heard again in Phnom Penh. Congregations starting to grow.
That speaks volumes about resilience, doesn't it? Faith enduring, even after that kind of persecution.
There's also mention of an elderly English missionary, a violinist actually, who'd been there since 1959.
Wow. Long-term presence.
Yeah. And she observed that the Christian ministry that happened among Cambodian refugees on the Thai border during the Pol Pot years
Okay.
that might have sort of prepared the ground, softened hearts for what came later.
That makes sense. Providing support in those desperate times could build connections.
And what came next was just extraordinary growth from those 600 or so survivors in 1990
Yeah.
to over 60,000 by the early 2000s.
60,000 from 600.
Incredible, isn't it? Baptists saw huge growth, about 10,000 members, 220 churches by 2001,
Okay.
and also a big indigenous denomination that came out of Campus Crusade for Christ's leadership.
It really makes you think about that human need for hope, for meaning, especially after such immense trauma and loss.
You have to wonder, providing aid, spiritual support, it can be incredibly powerful in helping people rebuild.
Definitely. That kind of growth highlights the potential for spiritual renewal, even after the darkest times.
But interestingly, the source also notes that this super rapid growth in Cambodia started to slow down around 2000.
Oh. Why was that? Not persecution this time.
No, apparently not. It was more internal factors. They're called movement poisons.
Movement poisons. What does that mean?
Things like maybe too much external funding coming in, which led to pastors being subsidized.
Creating dependency, maybe.
Perhaps. And maybe creating more of a professional minister class, a gap between leaders and ordinary people.
I see.
Also, things like accelerated institutionalization, maybe becoming too structured too quickly, and internal conflicts, often over who controlled the resources.
Right. That's a fascinating and cautionary point. Growth brings its own set of challenges. External help, even well-meant, can sometimes distort things if not handled carefully. We should probably delve into those dynamics more sometime.
Yeah, maybe in a future dive. But let's rewind to what drove that initial explosion in Cambodia.
Okay.
The arrival of Bruce and Gloria Carleton in 1990 seems key. They were called strategy coordinators.
Right. Bruce had experience planting churches, I believe.
He did, but their main focus wasn't planting churches themselves. It was training Cambodians to do it.
Ah, that principle again. Empowering local leaders, like we saw in Mongolia.
Exactly. It seems crucial.
So how did they approach it, the Carltons?
Very practically.
Yeah.
Bruce started by mentoring one Cambodian layman, helped him translate a book on church planting.
So transferring visions, skills right from the start.
Yep. And then that guy, the apprentice, he recruited 8 other men and a woman who were eager to learn.
Okay, building a core team.
And the training was super hands-on. Personal evangelism, Bible study, how to actually start a church, leadership skills.
Not just theory.
No, big emphasis on doing it, applying it right away.
And that seems to have paid off quickly, looking at the numbers.
Yeah, the multiplication was fast. 1 church, then 6 the next year, then 10, then 20.
And then the Baptist churches really took off following that pattern. 43, 78, 123 in the following years.
It's exponential almost.
What else did Carlton emphasize?
Prayer. He talked about an unprecedented level of prayer happening for Cambodia, praying for protection for the church planters, for people's hearts to be open. And the new believers themselves reported feeling God's direct involvement. Things they described as signs, wonders, healings, even exorcisms.
Those kinds of experiences, perceived supernatural encounters, often fuel the early stages of these movements, don't they? They create a strong sense of divine backing.
Empowers people in their new faith. Another big piece was something called RLTPs.
RLT.
Rural Leadership Training Programs.
Yeah.
Intensive 2-week modules. 8 of them spread over 2 years.
Okay. Who were they for?
Designed for bivocational leaders.
Yeah.
You know, people with regular jobs who couldn't just leave for months of training.
Practical again, tailored to reality.
Exactly. And get this, the new churches in their areas provided the meals for the trainees.
Oh, nice. Building community, shared ownership right there.
Totally. And the sources are clear. Where these RLTPs happened, church planting followed. Strong correlation.
That structure sounds very effective, and focusing on bivocational leaders keeps it grounded, less dependent on outside money too.
Carlton also had this principle, the 222 principle, based on Timothy 2.2 in the Bible.
Okay, what's the gist?
It's about lifelong mentoring. Always taking someone along with you, modeling the vision, the skills, the values, intentional personal multiplication of leadership.
That kind of relational discipleship, passing it on person to person, that's often fundamental to sustainable growth, isn't it?
Seems like it was key here. And after the Carltons left in '96, the missionaries who stayed apparently kept a low profile, focused on serving, not being the big leaders.
Which again reinforces that indigenous character. Smart.
You hear about the impact in remote areas too, like one area near Vietnam, over 40 new church starts just from these RLTPs. Entire villages, 30, 50 believers meeting in simple thatched roof homes.
Amazing. How did they structure these new village churches?
Often around a 7-member central committee.
Okay, interesting name. Where does that come from?
It adapted ideas from the book of Acts in the Bible, but used terminology people knew from the recent communist past.
Clever. Adapting to the local context. What kind of roles were on the committee?
Things like a worship leader, a Bible teacher, ministers for men, women, youth, outreach, and significantly, a literacy teacher.
Addressing that critical need after the Khmer Rouge basically wiped out the educated class. That's holistic.
Yeah, really meeting practical needs alongside the spiritual.
It shows real ingenuity, cultural sensitivity.
There's a great little story about a vegetable seller.
Yeah.
She was on one of these committees, and she'd asked her customers, do you have a Baptist church in your village? Just as an opener.
Simple, direct, grassroots.
Totally. And if they said no, other committee members would follow up, share their own stories, and invite the villagers to start their own church with their own 7-member committee.
That's brilliant. So organic, so replicable.
And the meeting places were simple. House churches, often built on stilts, fitted 40, 50 people sitting on the floor.
Humble beginnings.
And baptisms, sometimes happening in old bomb craters.
Wow. That image. Baptisms in bomb craters. Talk about a symbol of new life coming out of conflict and destruction.
Incredibly poignant, isn't it? One Easter, 70 new believers baptized in a crater. It really paints a picture of the transformation happening against that backdrop of trauma.
Definitely does. Okay, so we've seen Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Cambodia. What about other parts of Southeast Asia?
Well, the sources mention significant movements elsewhere too, but the details are often sketchier.
Why is that? Government pressure.
Seems like it. sensitivity around reporting in certain countries. But we hear about one coordinator, for instance, who saw 65,000 people become Christians.
65,000.
Yeah, and hundreds of churches started over 10 years. And this was despite severe persecution.
So the pattern wasn't isolated to just Mongolia and Cambodia. It was broader.
Seems so. Happening in multiple places, even with strong opposition.
What kind of church models were common in these other areas?
We hear about rural POCH churches. Sounds like the house church model again, maybe similar to China.
Okay. POUCH probably stands for something specific to that context.
Probably. And then in urban areas, growth often came through training existing house church networks on how to multiply more effectively.
Building on what's already there. Makes sense.
There's one specific example given of a home cell church network in a communist country.
Okay.
Grew to over 30,000 believers. Hundreds of house churches, maybe 150, 250 of them.
That's a substantial network. But risky, I imagine.
Definitely. Constant challenges with government surveillance, police cracking down if meetings got too big or visible.
So how did they navigate that?
Apparently, a turning point came after some leaders got training in Singapore.
Singapore again. What was the key idea from that training?
Focus on small multiplying cells. Keep the groups really small, like under 15 or 20 members, before starting a new one.
Stay under the radar. Avoid attracting too much attention.
Exactly. Be less conspicuous. And the result? They made plans to start 70 new home cell churches in just 1 week.
Wow. That's a very practical, strategic adaptation to grow, even under pressure. Shows real resilience and flexibility.
It does. Okay, so speaking of Singapore, maybe we should look there, and South Korea for some comparisons.
Yeah, good idea. Different contexts, again, more developed economies in many ways.
Right. Singapore, wealthy, urban city-state, its evangelical population more than doubled over about 3 decades.
And the model there shifted towards these, well, huge churches, but built around small home cell groups, right?
Exactly. Mega churches with massive cell networks. Examples given are Faith Community Baptist, City Harvest Church, thousands of members, hundreds and hundreds of cell groups each.
It's growth, but maybe a different kind of growth than the CPMs aiming to reach whole, unreached populations.
That's a point raised in the material. But there's similarities, too. The cell groups, training lay leaders.
And the demographics are different, too, right? Singaporean evangelicals, often highly educated professionals, higher home ownership.
Yeah, different socioeconomic picture compared to, say, rural Cambodia or Mongolia at the time.
What fueled the growth in Singapore?
Several things mentioned. Big evangelistic campaigns, like Billy Graham back in '78, the Jesus Film Project in '81.
Okay, large-scale events.
Yeah, rallies.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the government introduced religious education in schools in '84, and evangelicals apparently made good use of that opportunity.
Interesting.
Plus active student ministries on campuses.
So a mix of factors. Did anyone compare it directly to the church planting movement?
Yes, a local Singaporean observer did. They saw overlaps, belief in God's intervention, lay leader training, intentionally starting new groups, lots of evangelism, empowered cells, biblical authority.
Sounds familiar.
But the key difference noted was maybe the scope. These megacell churches tend to grow within the limits of one church's leadership capacity.
Whereas CPMs often have this vision to reach an entire people group or a whole city beyond just one congregation's structure.
Exactly. It's maybe a subtle but important distinction in the overall goal.
Okay. And South Korea. Seoul, specifically.
Another incredible urban story. Over 5.5 million Christians in Seoul, a city of 12 million back then.
Wow, half the city, almost.
Thousands of Protestant churches. And again, many are these huge megachurches with vast cell group systems.
Like Yoido Full Gospel Church, isn't that the famous one?
That's the one. 780,000 members reported at one point. Over 20,000 home cell groups. Just mind-boggling numbers.
It really is. And the Korean movement has deeper roots, right? Goes back further.
Yeah, over 30 years of sustained growth, resulting in, estimates say, over 10 million born-again Koreans nationwide.
What was the key historical factor there?
A lot of people point to the adoption of the three-self principle way back in the late 19th century.
Nevius's principles. Self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating.
That's it. Encouraging the Korean church to be independent and self-reliant from early on. Apparently, it wasn't easily accepted in China at the time, but the Koreans embraced it.
And that seems to have built a really strong foundation.
It seems so, because they faced intense hardship, later Japanese occupation, the Korean War.
Right. Huge challenges.
But the Protestant church kept growing. doubling roughly every 10 years between 1940 and 2000.
Incredible resilience.
By 2000, over 8.8 million Protestants in South Korea, maybe up to 40% of the population identifying with Christianity in some way.
And what used to be seen as this uniquely Korean phenomenon
Is now seen as sharing characteristics with these other church planting movements we've been talking about across Asia and the world.
It really drives home how these principles of local leadership, adaptability, maybe reliance on smaller group structures, prayer, they seem to pop up again and again in different places, leading to growth.
It's a global story with local expressions.
The Nevius principles, emphasizing that local ownership and financial independence, they really proved powerful for long-term sustainability in Korea.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, we've journeyed through quite a range of places and situations.
Yeah, post-Soviet Mongolia, post-conflict Cambodia, areas under government pressure, affluent Singapore, historically shaped South Korea.
And in all these diverse contexts, we saw significant Christian growth during that period, the 90s and early 2000s.
And some common themes definitely emerged.
Like what stands out most to you?
Well, the dedication of individuals, for one. Both the missionaries who went and, crucially, the local believers who stepped up.
Right, and that constant emphasis on training and empowering those local leaders.
Yeah.
Not keeping it foreign controlled.
Absolutely. The adaptability of the church structures, too, using cell groups, house churches, whatever fit the context.
The role of prayer seemed really prominent in many accounts, that sense of God being directly involved.
Yeah, and just the sheer resilience of faith, persevering through poverty, war, persecution.
It's quite something to consider.
So the provocative thought for you listening might be this. Looking at all these different strategies, these varied circumstances, what underlying principles really drove these movements?
And could those principles be transferable, relevant today, maybe even outside religious movement?
Exactly. What can we learn about building communities, about developing leaders, about perseverance, just from looking at these examples of really rapid transformation across Asia?
Something to think about.